Welcome to Common Space, a conversation between friends who happen to be United Methodist pastors. My name's Chris Estes.
Hi, Chris. I'm Daryl.
Hi, Daryl.
And I'm Ryan.
What's
Hi,
up,
Ryan.
Ryan.
Welcome, guys, and welcome to you, our listening audience. We appreciate it so much. And keep those cards and letters coming in. We appreciate those as well. So today we're looking at one of the wildest stories in the Bible, Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him. And Abraham just goes. No protest, no hesitation. Just early the next morning, loads up the donkey and walks 3 days with his son to the mountain. Now Isaac carries the wood. He even asks where the lamb is for the offering. Abraham gives this mysterious answer: God will provide. Then he builds an altar, ties up his son, raises the knife, and at the last moment, an angel calls it off. A ram appears in the thicket. Isaac lives. Abraham calls the place, the Lord will provide. Now, most of us grew up hearing this story as a test of faith. God tests Abraham. Abraham passes. End of story. But if we're honest, that's unsettling. Ryan, how have you heard this story?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty fair way to sum up the way that we interpret the story. You'll hear from a lot of different people that there are 10 different tests that Abraham has to pass in order to really be called faithful and to really fulfill and to exemplify the faith that God is calling him to. And this is kind of that 10th test, and it's always been interpreted as this kind of test, and Abraham passes with flying colors. There's this ancient story of this group of people called the oven stokers. And the reason that they were the oven stokers was because they were brilliant, but they weren't quite brilliant enough to become a disciple of this particular rabbi. And so they would stoke the oven in that rabbi's school so that they could still kind of glean from his words. And this rabbi one day is teaching about this story, which is called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac in the Jewish tradition. And they hear the rabbi talking about it. And then later that night, after the rabbi's gone to bed, they're talking about what was so great about Abraham and the story. And the first one says, I hear this story and I know that Abraham is such a faithful person. If God told me to sacrifice my only son, I don't think I could do it immediately like Abraham did. He got up the very next morning and he started to fulfill the commandment immediately. The second oven stoker says, I think that I could actually get up and go ahead and start doing it immediately the next morning. But I think I would have a heavy heart. So I'm not nearly as faithful as Abraham, because Abraham did it with joy over the opportunity to fulfill God's will. And the third oven stoker says, I think I could do it immediately. I think I could even do it with joy. But I think what was so great about Abraham is that when God told him to stop, it wasn't because he was excited about his child not dying that he was so joyful, but because he was given the opportunity to carry out yet another command of God. And so these oven stokers are all celebrating the blind obedience of Abraham and his joy in doing so and his unhesitancy to do so. And when I first heard that interpretation and that story about this, I was just about horrified. I couldn't believe that they were celebrating all this, because I just couldn't get past that question. What kind of God would demand this?
So it sounds like we've come by our understanding of it, honestly, from our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. And that's not to say there's not a varied interpretation within the Jewish tradition, but that's like one of the early fundamentals is that this is a test of faith.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the interpretations I was exposed to very early on, what Ryan just highlighted for us. It's kind of the standard interpretation, right? That it's a demonstration of total love and devotion to God to be willing to make this most precious sacrifice. Christians have done even weirder things with this interpretation. There's even one of our well-known theologians, a guy named Soren Kierkegaard. He wrote a book about it called Fear and Trembling, where he coined this phrase, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's the teleological suspension of the ethical, which is a fancy way of him saying that true faith causes you to act in absurd ways. So that's Christians taking this even in a weirder direction of saying that the point of this story is true devotion is willing to give anything up for God, and that we explain that by saying true faith is absurd, that true faith makes no sense. And that just never jived with me. And then when I had children, I knew very quickly that if this was going to be a test of my faith, I was out. In fact, I even wrote about it. I wrote about it and said, if this God would require me to sacrifice or even intend to sacrifice one of my children, then I'm out. I don't want any part of this God. I don't want to be in relationship with that kind of God. Another possible interpretation that we can get from our Jewish brothers and sisters, which can be helpful, right, is that this story points toward the fact that we can't always expect to be victorious. Sometimes we must expect bad things or expect defeat, and that we're being told not to attach too tightly to anything because we can expect detachment from almost everything. And that's a tough interpretation as well that we get from our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's not fun. It's not warm and fuzzy, but there's something there. And again, none of this was really helpful for me. When I look at these ancient stories, I try to come back to questions that I learned from one of my professors a long time ago, which is, so what? That's the question. So if you tell this story and you tell me that the purpose of this story is to check the level of my devotion to God, so what? What's the next thing? How do I use that to make sense of the world in which I'm living? How do I use that to get through a day in this life that I have, or to be a better person or in better relationship with the people around me? And none of those interpretations seem to really help me with that at all. So I agree with everything Ryan was saying and what you're pointing out, Chris. Our typical way of wrestling with this text is problematic.
No, Ryan, in ancient times, this idea of sacrifice was a way people operated. How did that work?
Right. I mean, so we talk about like how our devotional systems kind of form anthropologically, and the way that those things happen, the way that people deal with problems in the world around them, is that they start to attribute those problems to otherworldly things. If the crop's not growing, what on earth? I'm doing everything right, and I just don't know why the crop's not growing. Maybe it's because I disappointed an ancestor. Maybe it's because of something like that. And eventually you get to this idea that there is some sort of supernatural being or energy or whatever you want to call it that needs some sort of placation in order to give you what it is you need to survive. And so if the problem is a crop and you need the rain to come down and water your crop, you begin to notice that it rained the last time that I made an offering. And that offering might be a small offering at first. But then, if the rain keeps not coming and stuff like that, the anxiety grows. And we've talked about anxiety in some of our past podcasts. But as that anxiety grows, you start to be willing to give up just a little bit more. So maybe at first you're offering a little bit of your crop. And if that stops working, maybe you're going to start offering some of your animals. And if the animals begin to work, that reinforces the system. So you're like, oh, all right, so I'll just keep on sacrificing animals. And then all of a sudden, if that stops working, what are you going to give next? And just about the highest thing that you can give is either yourself or your family, your child. And so this idea of sacrifice and the anxiety that leads to sacrifice leads us to consider giving up more and more and more. And so the ancient world in which Abraham lived was a world in which there were plenty of people around Abraham that were willing to give up their children, that were willing to sacrifice children for the well-being of their tribe. And thank God we don't encounter that on an everyday basis anymore.
I think that is a very important point that we can make on this story and all of these stories that come across as archaic or barbaric to us. And the first thing we can do when the story seems archaic and barbaric is be grateful. Be grateful that you stand on the shoulders of generations of ancestors who have brought us to the point where child sacrifice no longer seems okay, right? That's not because we're better. It's not because we're smarter. It's because we're later, right? And so we can be grateful for that. And we can also be humble to recognize we probably have some things going on in our lives right now, in our cultures, that future generations are going to look back on us and go, what were they smoking when they were doing that? And that's a fair question. So hold it loosely. But Ryan brings up a very important point, and that is we can look at these stories and expect them to do more than one thing. And one thing an ancient story is going to do that was told by ancient people and eventually written down is it's going to have some pragmatic use for them, some practical use for their time and their place to deal with issues in which they were swimming. And one of those issues that Ryan just brought up is child sacrifice. In the ancient Near East, children were viewed as the property of their parents. In fact, we can even find in ancient Rome the principle of patria potestas, which allowed a father to do whatever they wanted to do with their child, including putting them to death. Child sacrifice was a reality in the times and places from which this story comes. And we can expect and allow this story to speak directly to that. Even if it doesn't speak directly to us in that level now, it did have something to say to them then, and that was that this God that the Hebrew Bible represents was not okay with child sacrifice. The Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the first 5 books repeatedly point to child sacrifice as among the worst of our behaviors. And the Bible has a very clear statement to make that children are not property. They're not owned. They're not to be treated as we would treat property. We parents do not own our children. The Bible's pretty clear to say a parent is one who knows that they do not own their child. Now, while that may seem as like basic common sense to us, it's okay that that was something that they were wrestling with then, and we can let this story speak to that in its time and place.
So this is an early example of an evolution of consciousness within the text. And I think that's a good way to look at a lot of the ancient stories in the Hebrew scripture. It demonstrates an evolution of consciousness where people move from ways of being to new ones as time passes and as they evolve relationally, socially, and spiritually as well. It's also indicative of an evolution of consciousness regarding this God and what this God's like. I think here we start to see this is not a God that requires child sacrifice, and that these ideas of sacrifice are old ideas and don't need to continue.
I agree. So Ryan, I have a question though. If what Chris is talking about is that we can see our consciousness as human beings evolve in these ancient stories, and we can agree that the consciousness and the struggles of those people at that time included things that we don't necessarily wrestle with anymore, does that mean this story has nothing to offer us now?
Oh, no, I think this story has so much to offer us. And I think, even if it is written from the perspective where it's celebrating this being a test and Abraham's passing it with flying colors, there's even a usefulness to understanding that that's a valid interpretation as well. Part of one of the interesting ways that we understand this story is that, when we see it in artwork, we often see Abraham with his small child climbing the mountain, right? And Chris made the point that Isaac carried the wood up the mountain. And so if Isaac is strong enough to carry enough wood to burn a human being up the mountain, then that must mean that Isaac is rather larger than a small child, right? And so not only is Abraham faithful in this, but Isaac, who is large enough to carry enough wood to burn himself, trusts his dad.
Yeah.
Like he trusts his dad, and he climbs up the mountain and right behind his dad, and he's looking around and he's carrying the bundle of wood, and he says, "Dad, where's the sacrifice?"
And Dad says, "Don't worry about it, and let me tie you down here."
Well, exactly. And so, that means that this man that had carried wood up the mountain with Abraham, who is older than 100 years old, allows himself to be bound and tied up on a pile of wood by his father. This means that Isaac is in on the thing.
Yeah, I have to interject. And here's the disclaimer, right? Like, we understand that some of our listeners, some people out there may have been taught this story one way your whole lives, and this could be a little destabilizing. And we're not trying to, be flippant with that. But at the same time, I just want to invite you to consider the possibility that there is a Monty Python element to this story where it is just absurd. And it's meant to kind of bring you to laughter. And don't miss this, folks. The characters in this story, the dad's name, Abraham, means father of the multitude. The mother's name, Sarah, means princess or noble woman. And the kid, the son to be sacrificed, Isaac, his name means laughter. So here's a story where the father, the princess, and their son, laughter, are doing this typical normal behavior thing for that time, but then we're also invited into some absurd things to hold on to, like a grown man-child carrying wood up a mountain to build an altar on which he's going to let his extremely elderly father tie him and raise like a knife above him to kill him. Like, there's just weird things going on here, not the least of which, as our friend Rob points out, in Genesis 22, verse 5, when all this is about to happen, Abraham says to his servants that have helped them make this journey to the sacrifice, he says, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." And there's this indication that Abraham might even be in on the joke, that Abraham might even know there's something more going on, something absurd about the idea of him sacrificing Isaac.
which speaks to his faith once again. So yeah, maybe it is a test of his faith. Maybe it is a test of whether or not he's actually willing to give up his son, whom he loves, in order to please this God. But maybe it's more of a test of his faith in the sense that, does this character Abraham trust God enough to actually provide something else besides the son? I think that's what's clever about this, is that you can read it both ways and celebrate both things. As we've talked about with a lot of these stories of Genesis, all of these stories are kind of common stories. These are stories that people are telling all the time. And so when this story starts, the hearers are going to say, oh yeah, I know how this goes. Abraham's going to climb the mountain. He's going to sacrifice his son just like everybody else has done. And then this God will celebrate Abraham for his faithfulness. But the interesting thing about what these stories tell us in Genesis is that there's these little twists, these little turns that these stories take in order to say our story's not like that. You know, this is the story you've heard over and over and over again. And after you hear this story, you're going to have a new understanding of what's actually required of you. So we get to this point of asking the question, what is it that our God actually requires of us? And we tell these stories. We tell the story of Abraham and Isaac. And we ask the question, what is it that this God requires? We have a story that's somewhat similar. There's a lot of common themes between the story of Job and the story of Abraham and Isaac. And Job actually does lose his children at the hand, almost indirectly, of God. Like God tells the Satan character, yeah, go ahead and kill his family. And so Job suffers at the hand of God. And it's a really, really weird story. And it's another story that asks us, what is it that this God requires of us? Who is this God? What kind of God is he? And we get to the point where there's this prophet Micah who's talking years later, and he asks this question directly. What is it that God requires of us? And he starts listing all these things. Does God require my money? Does God require my land? Does God require my houses? Does God require the thousands of bulls on the side of the mountain? Does God require me to sacrifice my child? And he finishes and he says, no, that's not what this God requires. And what does Micah say God requires? Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.
What does require mean there? I always have trouble with God requiring anything, to be honest with you.
I think that's a great question, Chris. What do you think require means there?
Yeah, when I hear that word require, I think, well, God is demanding something. God demands these three things for me to be in right relationship with God. And I don't quite see it that way.
How do you see it?
I see it. We are already in right relationship with God. We just need to wake up to that. And we can pursue that some more if you want to later. But let me tell you this. This story really hits home from a recovery and codependency angle, which I know a little something about.
Yes. Please tell us.
That's enough about me. What do you think about me?
I think you're beautiful.
Thank you. Now, Richard Rohr talks about the myth of heroic sacrifice. This belief that love has to be earned by giving up what matters most. Now, this mindset runs deep amongst us codependents. We think if we sacrifice enough, our time, our truth, our peace, then maybe we'll be safe or loved or finally get approval. Now, Abraham seems to be caught in that loop at this time, in this story. He doesn't even question the command. He just packs up and goes. But then grace shows up, right? The knife is stopped. The ram appears. It's like that higher power moment, as we would say in recovery, when we realize this God is not asking us to destroy ourselves to prove devotion. Step 3 says we turn our will and our lives over to the care of God, not to a punishing force, but to a God who provides, who interrupts the cycle, and who calls us to trust instead of perform. So when I hear demand or requires, counter to my experience.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's okay for us to look back at the consciousness of this story and say, wow, how enlightened and lucky and smart we are that we don't wrestle with child sacrifice anymore. And at the same time, look in the mirror and say, okay, but what am I thinking God demands of me? What do I think God requires for me to get the blessing that I want or get the things that I deserve or have the life that I want? Like, what does God require is still at the heart of this story. And yes, an ancient practice where this story comes from, worship was about what you gave to the gods. And there were practices of sacrifice and ritual that seem archaic to us now. But to say that we don't still approach worship with the idea that we're doing something for God, that's a little arrogant. Like, yes, we do. We do approach worship that way. And this story stands in the face of that and says, this God says, you don't do for me. I do for you. I provide. This is not about what you can bring me, what you can sacrifice for me. This relationship is going to be about, I will provide. If anything is needed, if we're going to have a barbecue, I'll bring the meat. That's what this story says. And I think it's okay for us to have both of those things going on.
Yeah, for me, the story's not about a demand for anything, a demand for death or sacrifice or anything else. It's really about waking up, letting go of fear-based religion, and realizing that God doesn't live in transaction, but in the provision.
Yeah. And like connect to the fact and be encouraged by the reality that you're not different from your ancestors. Your ancestors wrestled with transaction in their religion. The idea that our relationship with God is going to be, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And we wrestle with that too. We wrestle with transactionalism all the time. And it's hard not to. It's built into our economy. It's built into our culture. But this is something different. This is a relationship. And we know relationships where love exists, they're not about transaction.
All right, let me ask you guys this. So many people are taught that stories like this are meant to predict Jesus, that Abraham and Isaac is just a setup for the cross. And yeah, there's parallels like the beloved son, the wood on his back for 3 days in the mountain. But isn't it less about a prediction and maybe more about a pattern where God keeps disrupting sacrifice? Maybe showing up not to demand suffering, but to end it? Ryan, what do you think?
I love that question. So certainly the way that we tell the Jesus story absolutely has echoes and parallels with this story. And I think that that's intentional. And I do think that once again, it's about this question about how the relationship with our God goes. And so one of the things that I think about every time I think about these Genesis stories is how would this story speak to a people in exile? Because we know that the Torah was compiled when the people of Israel were in exile. And so while the story may be more ancient than the exile, it's those people in exile that are really putting these stories together, and the way that they put them together speaks to the situation that they're in. And the prophet Jeremiah, who is an exiled prophet who predicts the exile and then is exiled along with the people, has this part in Jeremiah chapter 7 where he's talking about what exactly the people have done to deserve their fate. And towards the end of chapter 7, God tells this prophet to tell the people of Judah have done evil in my eyes, declares the Lord. They've set up detestable idols in the house that bears my name, and they've defiled it. They've built the high places of Topheth and the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it even enter my mind. So beware, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer call it Topheth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter, for they will bury the dead in Topheth until there is no room. And the carcasses of this people will become food for the birds and the wild animals, and there will be no one to frighten them away. It is rather stark imagery, but it is God saying to the people, you started sacrificing your children. You started sacrificing your very own children. And this is something, as the divine being, I could not have even imagined. I cannot imagine a desire to sacrifice your own child. And so I think that has to inform the way that we interpret the Jesus story. And so even though that we tell this story in such a way where we very deliberately want our audience to be thinking about Abraham and Isaac and what God has asked of Abraham, I think what it's doing even more is reinforcing this other part, that what kind of God would require the sacrifice of a son? It's not this one. It wasn't this one in Abraham and Isaac's story. It wasn't this one when the people are in exile. And it's still not this God that requires a sacrifice of Jesus in order to be pleased at this point. And so the way that we interpret the Jesus story can't be one in which we say that an angry God demands the death of his son. I think we have to go a different direction. And this story tells us that we have to go a different direction.
Yeah, I agree. Clearly, we're opening up this conversation here at the end of the podcast about how we're going to explain the cross. And that's going to have to be for future episodes, because today we're just talking about Abraham and Isaac. But Ryan's pointing out that, yeah, how we hold these stories, how we interpret these stories is something that runs throughout the Bible, including how we interpret the suffering death of Jesus can be informed by these other stories. There is no doubt we've learned from our Jewish brothers and sisters this concept of remez. It's the Hebraic word that means a directional arrow or a hint. It's something that you put in a story that points to another story or points to another instance. And there is no doubt that the writers of these biblical stories are loading their stories up with these hints, with these directional arrows, these Easter eggs almost, that catch the attention of the listener or catch the attention of the reader. We are absolutely meant to connect the lamb that is sacrificed in this story to the lambs that get sacrificed in the Exodus, to John the Baptist calling Jesus the Lamb of God. We're supposed to make those connections, not for small historical scientific reasons, for big theological storytelling reasons. Connect these stories, connect this God, like Ryan just said, this God who's about love, this God who can't fathom, who can't imagine that you would want to sacrifice your child. Yeah, that's going to have to inform how we interpret the cross. And I know that opens up a whole mess of stuff. So consider that a cliffhanger for a future episode where we will talk about this.
Maybe you've got questions.
Yeah, maybe you want to send your questions about the cross in, but we'll get there.
So stories like this aren't necessarily predicting the future. That's not what's happening. I'm going to flat out say that. They're not predicting the future. So when you talk about the remez and each of these stories informing the other ones, we've got to look backwards. Right? We've got to say the more recent story is informed by the older stories. Not that the older stories are writing a script for future stories. Particularly in open and relational theology, which I like, is that God's actually experiencing the world with us moment by moment. And, he's not some puppet master setting things up, knowing the end from the beginning. So maybe what the Abraham and Isaac story is doing isn't forecasting the cross necessarily, but it's revealing something timeless about who God is. A God who disrupts sacrifice, who provides instead of demands, and invites trust instead of fear.
I couldn't agree more, Chris, and I'm going to be pretty brutal right now. When we reduce God to a fortune teller, we create a distance between us and God that I think is just terrible. God is not detached from our present, calling shots and hoping that we pick the right thing and interpret the signs the right way and pay attention to the fortune. I go back to the question I mentioned earlier, so what? If God's a fortune teller, where am I left? I'm left with code. I'm left subject to charlatans who are going to interpret that code, and they're going to interpret it in ways that allow them to manipulate me or to fundraise off of me. And it's where we do our worst work. And what you just said couldn't be more important. God's not detached from our reality. God is experiencing it with us. God is in it in every moment with me. God's not sitting back and predicting fortunes and giving me codes for how to go the right way. God is doing it with me.
Yeah, and to add to that, I do agree that these stories, especially this one, this story is not written to predict what's going to happen with Jesus. However, I do think that there is somewhat of a forecast in a lot of these stories. And the way that the prophetic literature is written, and the way that Genesis is written, the way that Deuteronomy is written, a lot of this, it's not predictive in the sense that, we're going to have to kill Jesus in order for the world to be saved. But it is predictive in the sense that it's saying if you continue to behave in such a way that you are willing to sacrifice your own children, then there is going to come to a point where you would actually be willing to sacrifice your own God. And that's going to be a problem. And so it's not predictive in the sense that like Jesus is the fulfillment of the story, but it is predictive in the sense that says you got to change the way that you're relating to the world because everything is going to go wrong if you continue to do this. Everything is going to go wrong.
Yep. Agreed. Children aren't property. We're not detached from each other. We don't get to kill each other, even in the name of God. That leads to our dehumanization, to our detachment, to our destruction.
All right. So earlier you had talked about like the absurdities in this story. There are more than one. There are several absurdities in the story. You mentioned a couple of them, but here's another one. How about the fact that Abraham wakes up after having this dream where God tells him to take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to this mountain and go and offer him there as a sacrifice. And Abraham wakes up and starts to do it. Like, that's absurd. But here's the really absurd part of that is that just a couple of chapters earlier in the story of Genesis, Abraham is visited by these mysterious guests. There's 3 of them, and we kind of surmise that they're angels of God, or maybe one of them is God. It's not very clear. But they visit Abraham, and then they depart from Abraham, and they tell Abraham, hey, we're going to go over to Sodom and Gomorrah, and we are going to destroy it. And Abraham is not silent. He doesn't just say, okay, go for it. Abraham argues over and over and over again with these angels of God or with God himself, saying, why on earth are you going to go and kill Sodom and Gomorrah? What if there are 50 good people there and you kill 50 good people? And the angels say, all right, if we'll find 50 good people, then we'll let them be free. And then he says, all right, well, you know what? 50 is not good enough. What if there's 40? And the angels or God says, okay, fine. But the absurdity is that Abraham so animatedly and vehemently argues for the sake of life in Sodom and Gomorrah. And when he's commanded to kill his own son, he just wakes up and goes about it. That's a little absurd, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Say more about possibly his age and how his mom could be thought of in this story.
Yeah, here's another really good one, right? So we talked a little bit about, Isaac is big enough to carry the wood up the mountain, but we think this is an interpretation. We think that maybe Isaac was actually 37 when this event happened. And the reason that we think Isaac is 37 when this event happened is because of the story that immediately follows. It says after they come down off the mountain, Abraham and his son return to his mom, and all of a sudden Sarah just dies. And she's 127 years old. And we know that she gave birth when she was 90, so that makes him 37. But what the funny, kind of funny, I don't know, absurdity of this is that Abraham comes home and probably tells the story to Sarah and says, hey, I was going to go kill your son. And God stopped me. And Sarah just, falls over dead. Like, oh my God, I married an idiot.
Now, I love it. And I love that what's happening there is that we're kind of representing, if you want to read this story literally, it's going to be even more absurd. You're going to have a 37-year-old Isaac. You're going to have a mother that hears the story of what's just happened and drops dead. I mean, it gets even more ridiculous. But if we hold this story as about a guy named Father and a mother named Princess and a son named Laughter, and they're wrestling with this concept of what does this God require? What does this God demand? And getting a pretty resolute answer of not this. And by the way, I don't need anything. I just want to be in relationship with you.
So in conclusion, maybe the story is not so much about a God that demands loyalty or any kind of impossible demands, but a God who interrupts the whole system of fear and sacrifice. God who shows up in our anxiety and says, you don't have to live like this anymore. Whether we're in recovery or Abraham on the mountain or just struggling in life in general, maybe what we're really seeing here is that we have a God who provides and walks with us and who blesses and keeps turning our expectations upside down.
Amen. And can tell stories that have more than one way in and more than one way out.
All right. Guys, any book recommendations?
First off, I recommend anything by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, but particular to what we've talked about today. He wrote a book called Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence. Jonathan Sacks. Check it out.
All right. My recommendation is Breathing Underwater, Spirituality and the 12 Steps by Richard Rohr, Chapter 3. That's where he talks about the myth of heroic sacrifice.
My recommendation is not a book this week, but it is a song, specifically a music video. Get on YouTube and search for Sonlux, Sonlux, and the music video for the song All Directions, and watch that. It's wonderful.
That'll do it for this month on the Common Space Podcast. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for listening. And thanks for your input and your affirmations. We really appreciate that. Critiques, they're appreciated as well. Just if you have any questions you'd like to hear us discuss, just send it in to commonspace@ahumc.org. And now, my brothers and sisters, may your eyes be filled with wonders, your heart full of joy, and your footsteps firm as you walk with God.
Peace.
Peace, my friends.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Common Space. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to this show so you don't miss a single episode. If you have a faith-related question you'd like to submit to the show for the chance of it being featured on a future episode, visit ahumc.org/questions to submit. That's ahumc.org/questions. If you'd like to contact the podcast team, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.